You think you know her. The dark, coal-lined eyes, the elaborate headdress, the barge on the Nile, perfumed sails and all, the asp coiled on the arm, the dramatic death, the 2,000 years of paintings and plays, and movies that have processed one woman's life into the most recognizable female silhouette in Western history. You think you know Cleopatra? You don't? Or rather, you know the version that the people who defeated her wanted you to know. The version that Octavian's propaganda machine manufactured and distributed with the specific efficiency of a man who understood that controlling the story about your enemy was as important as defeating them militarily. The version that Shakespeare embellished, that Hollywood glamorized, that 2 millennia of artistic imagination refined into something so vivid and so compelling that the actual woman underneath it has become almost invisible. The actual woman is more interesting, not more interesting in the way of actually, she was a nice person, or actually she wasn't that beautiful. The biographical corrective that punctures the myth and replaces it with something disappointingly ordinary. More interesting in the way of genuinely extraordinary. A person whose actual documented accomplishments, whose real political genius, whose specific historical situation was more complex and more fascinating than the romantic mythology that replaced it with the asp and the barge and the love triangle. Let's establish a few things immediately, because the mythology has been building so long that the facts feel like controversy. Cleopatra VII, Philopater, to give her the full name that the official record used, was not Egyptian in the ethnic sense that the popular imagination assumes. She was Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who took Egypt as his portion of the empire when Alexander died in 323 BCE, and whose dynasty had ruled Egypt for 300 years by the time Cleopatra was born. The Ptolemies were famously, sometimes catastrophically insular in their dynastic practices. The brother-sister marriages, the cousin marriages, the comprehensive reluctance to dilute the Macedonian bloodline with native Egyptian genetics that makes the Ptolemaic family tree look less like a tree and more like a wreath. Cleopatra was the first of the Ptolemaic dynasty to actually learn Egyptian. In 300 years of ruling Egypt, her predecessors had conducted their administration in Greek, treated the Egyptian language as the language of the subjects rather than the rulers, and maintained a cultural distance from the people they governed that the Ptolemaic system had institutionalized as policy. Cleopatra learned Egyptian, and not just Egyptian, but apparently 9 languages in total, including Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Parthian, and Latin, because she was a politician, and a politician who couldn't speak directly to her own people was a politician operating at a fundamental disadvantage. This detail, the languages, is in Plutarch, who is one of the primary ancient sources for Cleopatra's life, and who is recording it approximately a century and a half after her death, which means he's working from earlier sources and from the oral tradition that the ancient world transmitted between the event and the written account. Plutarch's account of Cleopatra's linguistic facility is embedded in a passage about her personal magnetism that has been used to support the irresistible seductress narrative, but the actual observation is more interesting than the narrative built around it. Here was a ruler who did her homework. Cleopatra was 21 years old when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. She was not the older, experienced woman of the mythology. She was a 21-year-old who had already been ruling jointly with her father, had already been deposed by her brother's faction, was currently fighting a civil war for her throne, and who understood with complete clarity that the arrival of the most powerful military commander in the Mediterranean world was the specific geopolitical development that her specific situation required her to exploit immediately and intelligently. The carpet story. We need to address the carpet story because it is one of the most famous images in the Cleopatra mythology, and because its meaning has been consistently misread. The story, from Plutarch, is that Cleopatra had herself rolled in a carpet or a linen sack and smuggled into Caesar's quarters to avoid her brother's guards, who would have killed her before she could make her case. The image that most people have is the romantic one. The exotic beauty emerging from the carpet in a cloud of perfume and charisma, and Caesar is instantly smitten. The actual image, if you think about it, is quite different. A 21-year-old woman in a desperate political situation in a country that is not currently hers took a significant personal risk. Being discovered meant death, to get into the room of the man whose military support could change everything, without the preparation or the ceremony or the performance of power that the diplomatic introduction would have permitted. She arrived, as far as we can tell from the sources, without the elaborate presentation that formal meetings required, and made her case from scratch. That's not seduction. That's courage. That's political calculation carried out under significant personal risk. The person who climbed into the carpet was not primarily thinking about her eyeliner. She was thinking about her kingdom. Let's tell the real story, all of it, from the beginning. Chapter 1. The world she inherited. Ptolemaic Egypt and the crisis of the 1st century. BCEE, you are born into a trap. Not immediately, not in the specific way of the bad birth that the mythology of tragic queens requires. You are born in approximately 69 BCE into the royal house of one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the Mediterranean world. The palace at Alexandria is the largest and most elaborate royal complex in the known world, its grounds containing libraries and museums and gardens and the various institutions that the Ptolemaic dynasty had built over 3 centuries of enlightened and occasionally completely unhinged patronage of arts and sciences. Alexandria itself is extraordinary. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast, it had become, in 3 centuries, the largest city in the Mediterranean world, after Rome. Perhaps 500,000 to 1 million inhabitants, depending on whose estimate you accept, with a population drawn from every corner of the Hellenistic world. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, Persians. Alexandria was cosmopolitan in the specific functional way of a city that was genuinely the commercial and intellectual center of its world, the place where the library accumulated the knowledge of antiquity, and where the Mouseion, the research institution that was the ancient equivalent of a university, attracted the scholars whose work the Ptolemaic patronage supported. The Great Library of Alexandria, the legendary repository of ancient knowledge that subsequent history has been mourning the loss of for 2 millennia, was in Cleopatra's time still one of the great intellectual institutions of the world, though its condition by the 1st century BCE was less pristine than the ideal suggests, and its relationship to the political realities of the Ptolemaic court was more complicated than the image of the pure temple of learning implies. The library was a political instrument as much as an intellectual one, a demonstration of the Ptolemaic dynasty's cultural ambition and its claim to be the legitimate heirs of Alexander's vision of a synthesized Hellenic civilization. The trap you are born into is the political trap. The Ptolemaic dynasty in the 1st century BCE was in deep, structural, possibly terminal trouble, and the specific nature of that trouble was the single overwhelming fact that shaped Cleopatra's entire political existence: Rome. The Roman Republic, by the 1st century BCE, transitioning into the political instability that would eventually produce the Roman Empire, was the dominant military and political power of the Mediterranean world, and its expansion had been consuming the Hellenistic kingdoms that Alexander's successors had built across the eastern Mediterranean with the patient, inexorable appetite of an empire that had not yet quite decided it was an empire, but was behaving like one regardless. Macedonia had fallen in 168 BCE. The Seleucid Empire, the vast kingdom that had stretched from Syria to the borders of India, was a shadow of itself. The Attalid kingdom of Pergamum had been bequeathed to Rome by its last king in 133 BCE in the specific act of surrender that the bequest represented. Egypt was the prize, the wealthiest territory in the eastern Mediterranean, the breadbasket of the ancient world, the source of the grain that fed the Roman urban population, and the papyrus that the Roman bureaucracy wrote on, and the linen that the Roman economy depended on. Egypt was the territory that Rome needed and had not yet taken, and the reason it had not yet taken it was the specific political calculation that the Roman Senate had been making throughout the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. The territory was too valuable, too strategically important, too potentially decisive in the hands of whoever controlled it to allow any single Roman general to take it, because the general who controlled Egypt controlled Rome's food supply and therefore controlled Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty survived in the 1st century BCE, not because it was strong, but because Rome hadn't yet resolved the internal political competition that would have allowed it to act decisively. Each Roman faction that competed for dominance within the Republic had its own relationship with the Ptolemaic court, its own client relationships, its own financial interests, its own specific reasons for wanting to preserve Ptolemaic cooperation rather than impose Ptolemaic conquest. The Ptolemaic kings navigated this Roman political complexity with the specific desperate expertise of people who understood that their survival depended on being useful rather than vulnerable. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was the specific embodiment of this desperate navigation, and his reign was both an education and a warning for the daughter who would succeed him. Ptolemy XII had spent enormous sums that required significant taxation of the Egyptian population and significant borrowing from the Roman banking interests that were intertwined with the Roman political system to maintain his relationship with Rome and his position on the Egyptian throne. In 58 BCE, Rome had annexed Cyprus, an island that had been under Ptolemaic control, without the military force that such an annexation would have required against a stronger kingdom, because the Ptolemaic dynasty was in no position to resist. Ptolemy XII's response to the Cyprus annexation was to stay silent, to maintain his relationship with Rome at the cost of his political credibility in Egypt. The Egyptian population, whose taxes were paying for the Roman relationship that had just failed to prevent the loss of Cyprus, was not pleased. Ptolemy XII was expelled from Egypt in 58 BCE and spent the subsequent years in Rome, lobbying the Roman political system for support for his restoration, spending money he didn't have on the political connections that the restoration required. He succeeded. In 55 BCE, a Roman military force under Aulus Gabinius restored Ptolemy XII to his throne at the cost of borrowing so heavily from the Roman banker Rabirius Postumus that the repayment essentially gave Postumus effective control of the Egyptian treasury. Ptolemy XII returned to Egypt with the Roman debt around his kingdom's neck and spent the remaining years of his reign. He died in 51 BCE, managing a situation in which Egyptian sovereignty was more theoretical than practical. This is the world Cleopatra grew up in. The palace was magnificent, the kingdom was wealthy, the dynasty was 300 years old and bore the accumulated traditions and religious authority of that long history, and the whole edifice was balanced on the edge of the Roman appetite, maintained in its position by a combination of strategic usefulness, Roman political paralysis, and the specific diplomatic skill of keeping all the Roman factions sufficiently satisfied that none of them decided that taking Egypt directly was worth the political cost within Rome of giving that much power to a single general. Cleopatra was educated in this reality from childhood. The palace was the place where the political education of a Ptolemaic heir happened not through formal instruction, but through observation. The embassies arriving, the correspondence with Rome, the calculations about which Roman faction to support in the current internal Roman conflict, the management of the Egyptian bureaucracy, the religious ceremonies that tied the Ptolemaic ruler to the Egyptian divine order and provided the legitimacy that 3 centuries of Macedonian rule had built in the specific idiom of Egyptian religion rather than Greek rationalism. The specifically Egyptian dimension of the Ptolemaic religious identity was one of the most interesting aspects of the dynasty's self-presentation. and it was the dimension that Cleopatra would take further than any of her predecessors. The Ptolemaic rulers had from the beginning adopted the Egyptian religious framework as their legitimating ideology, presenting themselves as pharaohs, as the embodied successors to the divine kingship that the Egyptian tradition had defined over 3,000 years, as the manifestations of the gods who organized and protected the cosmic order that Egyptian civilization was built on. Cleopatra VII took this identification with Egyptian religion further than any previous Ptolemaic ruler, presenting herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the goddess who was both the divine mother and the cosmic queen, the goddess who had gathered and restored the murdered body of Osiris, the goddess whose power encompassed both the political and the supernatural dimensions of queenship. The identification with Isis was not merely symbolic, it was a political strategy, a way of grounding the claim to Egyptian loyalty in the specific religious language that the Egyptian population understood and valued, and of presenting the Greek-speaking Macedonian ruler as the genuine expression of the Egyptian divine order, rather than its foreign administrator. This was the intelligence that Cleopatra brought to her inheritance. The understanding that power was not just military or financial, but also symbolic, that legitimacy had to be performed in the language that the audience for the performance understood, and that the multilingual, multicultural world she was born into required a ruler who could speak to each constituency in its own idiom. She was 21 when Julius Caesar arrived. She had already, by that point, been ruling Egypt jointly with her father for approximately 4 years, had been managing the Roman relationship at the highest level, and had been deposed by her brother's faction and was fighting to recover her throne. 21 years old, and already one of the most politically experienced operators in the Mediterranean world. Chapter 2: The Fall and the Carpet. How Cleopatra lost and regained her throne. The brother was a problem. Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's younger brother and, in the specifically claustrophobic tradition of the Ptolemaic dynasty, her co-ruler and nominal husband, was approximately 10 years old when their father died, and they inherited the kingdom jointly. Cleopatra was 18, the co-rulership of an 18-year-old. Experienced political operator and a 10-year-old child was not actually a co-rulership. It was Cleopatra's reign, with the fiction of joint rule maintained for the dynastic protocol that the Ptolemaic tradition required. The problem was not Ptolemy XIII himself, but the advisors who managed him and who understood that a child king was more useful to their specific interests than an adult queen who had her own views about how Egypt should be governed. The trio who dominated Ptolemy XIII's court: Pothinus, the royal eunuch and regent; Achillas, the general commanding the Egyptian army; and Theodotus, the rhetorician who served as the young king's tutor, were the specific individuals whose combined influence over the child king produced the political crisis that deposed Cleopatra in 48 BCE. The specific mechanism of the deposition is not entirely clear from the surviving sources, but the result is clear. By 48 BCE, Cleopatra had been expelled from Alexandria and was in Syria, assembling an army to retake the kingdom by force. The civil war between Cleopatra's forces and those of Ptolemy XIII's faction was well underway when Julius Caesar arrived at Alexandria in pursuit of his great rival Pompey. The Pompey situation requires explanation because it was the specific geopolitical event that set the stage for everything that followed. The Roman Civil War between Julius Caesar and Pompey, the conflict between the two most powerful men in the Roman world, had been resolved at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in August of 48 BCE, where Caesar's forces had defeated Pompey's comprehensively. Pompey had fled toward Egypt, the one remaining major power in the eastern Mediterranean that might provide him refuge and support. Pothinus and Ptolemy XIII's council faced a specific unpleasant decision. Pompey was arriving asking for help. Caesar, who had just destroyed Pompey's army, was not far behind, The Ptolemaic court had historical connections with Pompey, who had been a patron of Ptolemy XII during the Restoration. But Pompey was now the losing side of a conflict whose outcome had been decided, and sheltering the losing side when the winning side was approaching was not the rational political calculation. The decision that Ptolemy XIII's council made was the decision that revealed the specific, cynical quality of the political intelligence they possessed. They had Pompey killed. Not an open battle, not in a formal execution. Stabbed in a small boat as he was being brought ashore, his head separated from his body and preserved, to be presented to Caesar as proof of Ptolemaic loyalty to the winning side. Caesar's reaction to the gift of Pompey's head was not the gratitude that the council had calculated on. Caesar had been fighting Pompey 4 years, had driven him from Italy, had defeated his armies in multiple campaigns. But Pompey was a Roman consul, a Roman general, a Roman of the most elevated status, and his murder by Egyptian subordinates was not the convenient removal of a political problem. It was an affront to Roman dignity, and Caesar's famous response, weeping at the sight of the preserved head, was either genuine emotion for a man who had been his son-in-law, an ally, before becoming his enemy, or it was the specific political performance of a man who understood that accepting the murder as a gift would associate him with it. Caesar arrived in Alexandria with a small force, not the army he would have brought if he had been planning a conquest, but the several thousand soldiers of an escort appropriate to a Roman consul conducting political business. He established himself in the royal palace, took possession of Pompey's affairs, and set about mediating the dispute between the two Ptolemaic siblings as the Roman authority that both sides needed to court. Cleopatra understood immediately what Caesar's arrival meant. The arbiter of the Ptolemaic succession dispute was now in Alexandria, and the arbiter was the most powerful man in the Roman world. Her brother's faction controlled the approaches to Alexandria. She couldn't simply walk in and present herself at the palace without being intercepted and killed. So she did the thing that the carpet story records. She had herself smuggled inside the linen sack or carpet that Plutarch describes, carried through the palace by the Sicilian merchant Apollodorus, who served as her agent. The meeting that followed was the meeting that changed Cleopatra's position permanently, but not for the reasons the mythology emphasizes. Caesar didn't decide to support Cleopatra because he found her irresistible. He decided to support her because supporting Cleopatra was the rational political choice. The older sibling, the one who had been effectively running the kingdom, the one who spoke the languages and had the administrative experience and had been managing the Roman relationship at the highest level. She was the more valuable ally. She was also, in the Ptolemaic system, the legitimate senior co-ruler, and Caesar's intervention on her behalf could be framed as the restoration of legitimate authority rather than the imposition of Roman preference. Ptolemy XIII's faction did not accept this reading. The Alexandrian War, the siege of Caesar and Cleopatra in the royal palace by the forces of Ptolemy XIII's army, led by Achillas, was the immediate military consequence of Caesar's decision, and it was a genuinely dangerous situation. Caesar's forces were small, the city was hostile, and the Egyptian army was larger and more familiar with the terrain. The famous burning of the ships in the harbor, the fire that may or may not have spread to damage part of the library of Alexandria, one of the ancient world's most contested historical questions, was Caesar's defensive measure to prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him. The Alexandrian War lasted from late 48 BCE to early 47 BCE, when Caesar's reinforcements arrived and the military balance shifted decisively. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. The sources suggest he fled the final battle and was killed attempting to cross the river, though the specific circumstances are unclear. His body was apparently recovered and identified by his golden armor, a detail that suggests the identification was important enough to record, and that the death was confirmed rather than assumed. Cleopatra was restored to the throne. The Ptolemaic co-rulership formula required a new co-ruler. The system was built around the sibling pair, and Cleopatra's younger brother, the 11-year-old Ptolemy XIV, became the nominal co-ruler. He would remain nominal throughout his brief co-rulership, dying in 44 BCE in circumstances that the sources describe with the studied vagueness that ancient writers deployed around politically sensitive deaths, the implication being that Cleopatra had him eliminated when his continued existence became inconvenient. Caesar stayed in Egypt for several months after the military situation was resolved, longer than the purely political business required, which is the basis for the historical inference that the relationship between him and Cleopatra was more than political. The Nile cruise that Plutarch and other sources describe, Caesar and Cleopatra traveling up the Nile in the elaborate royal barge with a substantial fleet escort, is one of the more romantic images of the ancient world, and it was also, practically speaking, a political tour of the territory, a demonstration of the restored queen's authority and her Roman backing. When Caesar left Egypt, Cleopatra was pregnant. Chapter 3. Caesar's son, the politics of motherhood in the ancient world. The child born in 47 BCE was named Ptolemy Caesar. The Alexandrians called him Caesarion, Little Caesar, and the nickname stuck, becoming the name by which history knows him. He was 3 years old when Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. And his existence, the possible son of the most powerful man in Rome, was the specific political fact that would define the last decade of Cleopatra's reign and ultimately contribute to her destruction. The question of whether Caesar acknowledged Caesarion as his son is one of the genuinely uncertain historical questions of the period. Caesar had no legitimate son. His only child from his marriage to Calpurnia had died in infancy, and the heir he had designated through adoption was his great-nephew Gaius Octavius, who would become Augustus. The acknowledgement of Caesarion would have complicated the Roman succession in ways that Caesar may have found useful or may have been actively managing against. The ancient sources are contradictory. Some suggest Caesar acknowledged the child, some suggest he didn't, and the ambiguity served various political interests at various times in the subsequent years. Cleopatra arrived in Rome in 46 BCE and was installed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, the specific location outside the city proper being significant, as it allowed Caesar to host the queen of a client kingdom without the political problems that installing a foreign monarch within Rome itself would have created. She stayed for approximately 2 years, a presence in the Roman social world that generated the specific kind of aristocratic hostility that a powerful foreign woman with obvious influence over the most powerful man in Rome could be expected to generate. Cicero hated her. This is documented in Cicero's letters, with the specific personal venom of the man who prided himself on representing Roman Republican values and who found Cleopatra's presence in Rome and her influence over Caesar an affront to everything he thought the Roman state should be. Cicero's letters about Cleopatra are not merely politically critical. They are personally contemptuous in the way that the Roman aristocratic male could be contemptuous of the foreign, the female, and the foreign female in particular. He makes a reference to her being arrogant and dismissive in their single personal encounter, which suggests they did meet, and that Cleopatra did not particularly modulate her behavior for the Roman senator's benefit. This detail is interesting. Cleopatra was a monarch, the queen of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean world, the descendant of 3 centuries of royal tradition, the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. The expectation that she should be deferential to a Roman senator because he was a Roman senator was the expectation of someone who had not fully processed the specific register of identity that Cleopatra occupied. She wasn't a Roman client, she was an allied monarch. The specific failure of deference that Cicero complained about was probably the failure to perform the subordination that the Roman aristocratic ego expected from everyone who was not Roman. Caesar was assassinated on March 15th, 44 BCE, by the senatorial conspiracy that believed, with the specific combination of genuine political principle and personal grievance that the ancient sources make difficult to entirely separate, that he was transforming the Roman Republic into a monarchy. Cleopatra was in Rome when this happened. She returned to Egypt shortly afterward, taking Caesarion with her. The political situation in Rome, after Caesar's assassination, was the specific chaotic multi-sided conflict that produced the subsequent 20 years of Roman civil war, and ultimately the Roman Empire. The main players: Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and co-consul; Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir; and Lepidus, the third member of what would become the Second Triumvirate, were competing for the inheritance of Caesar's political position, with the specific urgency of men who understood that the inheritance was the most valuable political prize in the world. Cleopatra watched all of this from Egypt with the specific focused attention of a ruler whose kingdom's survival depended on correctly identifying which Roman faction to align with. The choice she made, and the moment at which she made it, was one of the most consequential political decisions of the ancient world. Chapter 4. Mark Antony, the alliance that changed everything. Mark Antony came to her. This is the detail that the mythology obscures in its eagerness to cast Cleopatra as the seductress who pursued and captivated the powerful Roman. Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BCE, the city in southern Turkey, where he was conducting the administration of the eastern provinces that were his share of the Roman world under the Triumvirate's division. The summons was the assertion of Roman authority. The queen of the client kingdom was to present herself before the Roman magistrate. Cleopatra's response was the staging of an entrance so elaborately calculated that Plutarch's description of it has been quoted and paraphrased and reproduced for 2,000 years, and Shakespeare's version of it, Enobarbus's speech in Antony and Cleopatra, is among the most famous passages in English literature. She came by barge, the famous barge with the purple sails and the silver oars, the golden stern, the perfumed atmosphere, the costumed attendants. She came as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty, performing the specific visual language of divine manifestation that the Hellenistic world understood and that communicated to the audience that watched her arrive that the person on that barge was not a petitioner presenting herself before a Roman magistrate. She was a queen arriving for a negotiation between equals, possibly between a queen and a lesser party. Because while Antony had the Roman armies, Cleopatra had the Egyptian treasury, and both parties understood this arithmetic. The relationship that developed between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was different in character from the relationship with Caesar, though the mythology has tended to conflate them into the same narrative of the dangerous foreign queen using her personal magnetism to compromise Roman men. The Caesar relationship was shorter, more politically urgent, more clearly instrumental on both sides. Two people at the beginning of their careers using each other's resources for specific, definable political goals. The Antony relationship was longer, more complex, and by the end of it had the character of a genuine political partnership, in the specific sense that their fates became genuinely identical. What happened to one happened to both. Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria with Cleopatra. They founded what the ancient sources describe as the Society of Inimitable Livers, the club of extravagant entertainment that the two courts created together, whose specific activities the ancient sources describe with the combination of admiration and moral disapproval that the Roman response to excess typically produced. The feasting, the hunting, the theatrical performances, the philosophical debates, the entertainments of the Ptolemaic court, combined with the entertainments of a Roman military culture, were the social expression of a relationship that was also a political alliance, and that both parties had reasons to invest in publicly as well as privately. Antony left Alexandria in 40 BCE, summoned by the political crisis in Rome. His wife Fulvia had been leading a military campaign against Octavian in what may have been an attempt to recall her husband from Egypt, and the situation required his attention. He never came back to Alexandria for 3 years. During those 3 years, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the children of Antony who were born without Antony present, and who were 3 years old before he returned. The political situation in Rome had shifted significantly in those 3 years. The death of Fulvia and the subsequent political necessity of Antony marrying Octavia, Octavian's sister, the politically motivated marriage that was meant to seal the alliance between the two triumvirs, created the specific situation in which Antony had a Roman wife in Rome and an Alexandrian queen in Alexandria, and a political partnership that required both relationships to coexist. Octavia was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable intelligence and genuine dignity, who managed her position with a composure that the subsequent events made increasingly difficult to maintain. Antony returned to Alexandria in 37 BCE. He and Cleopatra formalized their relationship in terms that the Roman world would find increasingly provocative: the donations of Antioch, in which Antony allocated Roman-controlled territories in the eastern Mediterranean as kingdoms to be ruled by Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion was declared the legitimate son of Julius Caesar and co-ruler of Egypt with his mother. The twins received kingdoms in the east. A third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was born in 36 BCE. The donations of Antioch were the specific political act that made the rupture between Antony and Octavian inevitable, because they represented Antony using Roman military conquests to build a Ptolemaic Roman hybrid empire in the east that would have been, if successful, a counterweight to Octavian's power in the west. The territorial gifts were real in the sense that Antony had the military authority to make them, and they were provocative in the specific way of a Roman general disposing of Roman conquests without the Senate's authorization and for the benefit of a foreign queen and their mixed heritage children. Octavian's propaganda operation went into full production. The specific genius of Octavian as a political operator, and he was, in this respect, one of the most effective political operators in history, was his understanding that the war he needed to fight against Antony could not be presented to the Roman public as a civil war between two Roman factions competing for supreme power, because the Roman public was exhausted by civil war and would not support another one enthusiastically. It had to be presented as something else. It was presented as a war against Cleopatra. Chapter 5. The War of Propaganda. How Octavian destroyed Cleopatra's reputation before he destroyed her kingdom. Octavian understood something that is still true. The most effective propaganda is not the propaganda that invents things from nothing. It is the propaganda that takes real elements of a situation and frames them in the way most damaging to the target, selectively emphasizing some facts, omitting others, and surrounding the whole construction with a narrative framework that makes the desired interpretation feel like the natural, obvious, common-sense reading of the available evidence. The real elements of Cleopatra and Antony's situation were a Roman general in a romantic and political relationship with a foreign queen, territorial disposals that had benefited the queen and her children, the adoption of Egyptian religious and cultural practices by the Roman general, the sidelining of Octavia in favor of the Eastern queen, and the gathering of the Eastern Roman military forces under the joint command of the two partners. Octavian's reframing of these elements. A Roman general who had been seduced and enslaved by an Oriental temptress. A man who had abandoned his Roman identity and his Roman wife for the luxurious corruption of the Eastern court. A foreign enemy queen who was using the captivated Roman as her instrument for the conquest of Rome itself. An existential threat to Roman values, Roman masculinity, and Roman civilization, posed by a woman whose specific threat was the threat of her sexuality. The Roman poets of the Augustan period, Horace, Virgil, Propertius, produced the specific literary version of this propaganda framework that the subsequent 2 millennia absorbed and transmitted. Horace's Cleopatra is the fatal monster, whose wine cups and oriental luxury corrupted Antony. Propertius's version has Cleopatra setting her mosquito nets against the walls of the Capitol, the image of the Eastern queen's ambitions reaching to the heart of Rome. The poetic production of the Augustan period was genuinely great literature, and it was also political messaging of the most effective kind. The political message embedded in aesthetic beauty in the way that makes the message harder to identify as a message. The specific Roman anxieties that Octavian's propaganda exploited were the anxieties about Eastern luxury and Eastern influence on Roman virtue that had been a feature of Roman moral discourse since the conquest of the Hellenistic East in the 2nd century BCE. The fear that Roman soldiers would be corrupted by Eastern luxuries, that Eastern women were specifically dangerous to Roman masculinity, that the Orient represented a seductive dissolution of the virtuous simplicity that the Roman myth of origins had made the foundation of Roman identity. These were existing cultural anxieties that Octavian's propaganda gave a specific, named focus in the figure of Cleopatra. The actual record of Cleopatra's conduct, the administrative record, the papyri from Egypt, the fragmentary evidence of how she governed, presents a picture that is entirely incompatible with the Horatian temptress. She was an active interventionist administrator. She maintained the Egyptian agricultural and commercial economy that was the basis of her kingdom's extraordinary wealth. She managed the complex religious institutions of Egypt, the temples, the priesthoods, the divine economy, with the same attention to practical detail that her secular administration received. She issued decrees, adjudicated disputes, managed the bureaucracy that ran the most complex administrative state in the Mediterranean world. In 47 BCE, during the Alexandrian War, she apparently helped manage the logistics of the military operation alongside Caesar. In the subsequent years, she ran Egypt during Antony's long absences, without the administrative machinery of the kingdom deteriorating in ways that would have been visible in the record. The Egypt that Antony returned to in 37 BCE was the Egypt that Cleopatra had been managing effectively for 6 years without him. The Actium campaign, the military confrontation between the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra and the forces of Octavian, was the result of the political rupture that the donations of Antioch had made inevitable. Octavian had the senatorial declaration of war against Cleopatra that made the conflict officially a war against a foreign enemy rather than a civil war. A legal and political distinction that the reality of the situation didn't fully support, but that the propaganda had made credible enough for the Roman public to accept. The Battle of Actium in September of 31 BCE was the specific military event that decided the conflict, and it was a naval battle in which the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was defeated by the fleet of Octavian's Admiral Agrippa. The specifics of the battle, who decided what, who fled first, whether Cleopatra's withdrawal with a portion of the fleet was a planned escape or a military disaster, have been debated by historians for 2,000 years, and the ancient sources themselves disagree on the details in ways that reflect the propaganda interests of their respective authors. What is clear is the outcome. The battle was lost. Antony and Cleopatra withdrew to Egypt. Octavian followed. Chapter 6. The last year. Cleopatra's political maneuvering in the face of defeat. She was not finished. This is the thing that the mythology's focus on the romantic tragedy consistently misses about the last year of Cleopatra's life. She spent most of it not weeping dramatically over the approaching end, but working at the specific, urgent, politically sophisticated problem of how to survive the defeat at Actium, how to negotiate with the winner, how to preserve Egypt's independence, or at least its dynasty, how to ensure that her children survived, and how to manage the specific complicated situation of a Roman commander who was simultaneously her partner, her co-strategist, and increasingly her liability. Antony's psychological collapse after Actium was the specific complication that Cleopatra had to manage alongside everything else. The ancient sources describe Antony in the months after Actium with the specific language of the man who has lost his sense of purpose. Withdrawing, refusing visitors, building himself a small retreat on the harbor's edge that he called the Timoneum, after the Athenian misanthrope. Timon, apparently identifying more strongly with Timon's rejection of the world than with the practical requirements of the situation he was actually in. Cleopatra did not have the luxury of Antony's despair. She was a queen with a kingdom, with children, with administrative responsibilities that continued regardless of the geopolitical catastrophe unfolding around her, and with the specific political intelligence to understand that the negotiation with Octavian was the only path that offered any possibility of a viable outcome. She began negotiations with Octavian almost immediately after Actium. The specific content of these negotiations is not entirely preserved in the ancient sources. The letters between Cleopatra and Octavian, if they were recorded, did not survive in a form accessible to us, but the general outline is clear from the historical record. She was exploring the possibility of retaining her throne under Roman suzerainty, the specific arrangement that various client kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean had made with Rome, and that would have preserved at least the form of Ptolemaic rule in Egypt. She was also simultaneously exploring the possibility of escaping. The plan to transport her fleet overland from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, dragging the ships across the Isthmus of Suez, a genuinely staggering logistical undertaking, was apparently a real project designed to allow Cleopatra to escape to the east with her treasury and her fleet intact, beyond Octavian's reach, and potentially to rebuild her power base somewhere outside the Mediterranean world. The ships were dragged. The Nabatean Arabs, whose territory controlled the overland route, burned them, whether on Octavian's instruction, on their own initiative, or for reasons that the ancient sources don't clarify. The eastern escape route was closed. The treasury negotiations were the other dimension of Cleopatra's last year maneuvering. She had assembled the Ptolemaic treasury in the mausoleum she was constructing, the large, elaborate tomb that the ancient sources describe as containing gold and silver and precious stones and jewels, and the various treasured possessions of the Ptolemaic dynasty accumulated over 3 centuries. The concentration of the treasury in the mausoleum served multiple purposes. It was being prepared for her funeral, if it came to that. It was leverage in the negotiation with Octavian, whose appetite for the Ptolemaic treasure was a known quantity. And it was a threat, the specific threat that the ancient sources document, that if Octavian moved against her, she would burn the treasury. The threat of burning the treasury was not a romantic gesture. It was a sophisticated negotiating position. Octavian's interest in Egypt was partly political, the strategic and economic importance of the territory, but it was also personal and financial. The Ptolemaic treasury was the largest single concentration of wealth in the Mediterranean world, and a significant proportion of Octavian's subsequent political programs, the building campaigns, the grain distributions, the military pay, was funded by what he took from Egypt. Cleopatra burning the treasury was Cleopatra removing one of the primary incentives for Octavian to keep her alive. Octavian's negotiating position was that he wanted the treasury, he wanted Egypt, and he wanted Cleopatra to appear in his triumph, the Roman victory parade in which the defeated enemy was displayed to the Roman public as the visible proof of the commander's victory. The triumph was not merely symbolic, it was one of the most politically significant rituals of the Roman system, though formal affirmation of military achievement that elevated the triumphant general's status in the Roman political hierarchy. Having Cleopatra walk in chains through Rome would be the specific public demonstration of Octavian's defeat of the Eastern threat that his propaganda had been building toward for years. She had no intention of appearing in his triumph. The ancient sources are consistent on this point. Cleopatra understood exactly what the triumph meant, and she was determined to avoid it. The subsequent question, and it is the question that her death, when it came, raises with full force, is whether she calculated that Octavian would allow her to live after the triumph, or whether she knew the answer to that question, and drew the specific conclusion that the knowledge required. The fall of Alexandria to Octavian's forces happened in August of 30 BCE. Antony's death preceded Cleopatra's by a matter of days, and the circumstances of his death are one of the ancient world's stranger episodes. The story, from Plutarch, is that Antony received a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, and that in response, he attempted to fall on his sword in the Roman tradition of the honorable suicide. He was not immediately successful and was brought to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she hauled him up through a window. She had locked the doors and would not open them, fearing a trick. With the help of 2 women, a scene of considerable practical difficulty that the ancient sources describe with a specificity that has the ring of genuine witness account. Antony died in her arms, as the phrase goes. He had time for a conversation, for the exchange of last words that the ancient sources record in the tradition of the significant death speech that the ancient biographical tradition expected at the deaths of major figures. Whether the specific words are accurate or composed for the occasion is the standard question about such material, and the standard answer applies. The words may or may not be exactly what was said, but the ancient sources believed they conveyed the truth of the moment. Chapter 7. The death. What actually happened, and what the ancient sources tell us. The Asp story is probably not true. Let's deal with this directly, because it is the most famous detail of the most famous death in ancient history, and the historical evidence for it is considerably weaker than 2,000 years of paintings and theatrical productions would suggest. The Egyptian cobra, Naja Hajj, the asp of the ancient sources, is a large snake. The size necessary to deliver a lethal dose of venom to an adult human being is the size of a snake that is difficult to conceal in a basket of figs, which is the specific concealment method that the primary version of the story describes. The venom of the Egyptian cobra kills through neurotoxic mechanism. It causes respiratory failure, and the death is not the quick, painless, barely perceptible fading that the romantic tradition imagines, but a slow and not entirely comfortable process that would have been visible to the people present. 2 other women died alongside Cleopatra, her attendants Charmian and Iris, and the 3 simultaneous deaths from snake venom, with a single snake, supposedly the instrument, require the snake to have bitten all 3 in succession, which stretches the credulity of the mechanism considerably. The alternative version, that Cleopatra used a poison from her medical knowledge, possibly applied through a hairpin or some other concealed mechanism, is a possibility that the ancient sources themselves mention alongside the snake story. What we know with certainty is Cleopatra died on August 12, 30 BCE, at approximately the age of 39. She died in the mausoleum. Octavian was informed before he had time to prevent it. Her 2 attendants died with her, or very shortly after. The cause of death was determined by Octavian's physicians who examined her body to be poison, though the type of poison was not definitively established from the examination. The motive for the suicide, if that is what it was, and the ancient sources are nearly unanimous in treating it as deliberate self-administered death rather than murder, was, in the most straightforward reading, the specific alternative to the alternative. The alternative was Octavian's triumph. The ancient sources record that Cleopatra had been informed, through a sympathetic Roman officer named Cornelius Dolabella, that Octavian was planning to transport her to Rome within 3 days. 3 days was the specific deadline she was working against. Octavian's account of the death, and it was Octavian's account, ultimately, that shaped the primary historical record, because Octavian controlled the information that Rome received about what had happened in Alexandria. Emphasized the dramatic, the romantic, the tragic. The queen who died rather than walk in his triumph was a better story than the queen who was killed by the victor, and it was a story that served Octavian's interests in specific ways. It confirmed his power. She was so comprehensively defeated that death was preferable, and it removed the awkward question of what he would have done with her had she lived. The meeting between Cleopatra and Octavian that preceded the death is one of the ancient world's most interesting and most debated episodes. Octavian visited her in the mausoleum after Antony's death. The ancient sources describe a meeting in which she presented herself in the condition of someone who had been in distress, perhaps deliberately disheveled, perhaps genuinely so, and in which she made her case for her position and her survival. Octavian's response was non-committal. The ancient sources record him as reassuring, which Cleopatra apparently assessed accurately as the specific reassurance of someone who had no intention of keeping the implicit promise. The ancient sources record that she asked to be buried with Antony. Octavian apparently agreed to this request, and it was honored, though the specific location of the shared tomb was lost in the subsequent history of Alexandria and has not been found, despite numerous archaeological investigations. The request itself, and its granting, is one of the small, human details of the story that the mythology has absorbed and the historical record preserves. She wanted to be buried with him, and the man who had defeated both of them apparently saw no political cost in permitting this. The preparation for death that the ancient sources describe, the bath, the meal, the specific arrangement of her person, is the preparation of a woman who was doing the last thing she could control after the kingdom and the children and the position and everything else had been resolved against her. She dressed in her royal robes. She held the scepter. She was found, according to Plutarch, with her crown straight. Charmian, who was dying herself, was still adjusting it when Octavian's guards arrived. The guard who cried out, "Was this well done of your lady Charmian?" received the answer, "Extremely well, and befitting the descendant of so many kings." The line is probably Plutarch's composition, the polished epigram that the ancient biographical tradition placed at the significant moment, but its sentiment is genuine to the record of the situation. Cleopatra died in the full exercise of her identity as queen, as royal person, as the descendant of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Whatever had been taken from her in the last year, she died as herself. The question of what she was thinking in those last hours, what she understood about the situation she was in, what she hoped for or feared, what the specific emotional content of the decision she was making is the question that no historical record can answer, and that the 2,000 years of artistic imagination have been attempting to fill in ever since. The paintings and the plays and the poems and the films are all attempts to answer that question, and none of them are Cleopatra because none of them have access to what Cleopatra actually was. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. What Octavian did with Egypt and with Caesarion. Caesarion was 17 years old when his mother died. He had been sent away from Alexandria before Octavian's arrival. Cleopatra had dispatched him eastward with the treasury escort that was supposed to facilitate either his escape to the east or his preservation as the Ptolemaic heir in whatever political settlement the negotiations might produce. He was in the process of making his way toward India, or toward Ethiopia, or toward some other destination beyond Octavian's reach, when he was recalled. The recall was the trap. Roden, the tutor who was with Caesarion, apparently convinced him that Octavian intended to treat him as a king. That returning was safe. Rodan may have been genuinely deceived, may have been bribed, or may have been one of Octavian's agents from the beginning. The ancient sources don't provide clarity. Caesarion returned to Alexandria. Octavian had him killed. The killing of Caesarion was the specific political act that revealed Octavian's understanding of his own position with a clarity that no diplomatic language could obscure. Caesarion was the son of Julius Caesar, or at least claimed to be, and the claim was widely believed. He was the heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty. He was the co-ruler of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean world. His existence was, from Octavian's perspective, an unresolvable problem. Octavian was Julius Caesar's heir, by adoption, not by blood, and his authority derived in significant part from the claim to be Caesar's legitimate political successor. A biological son of Caesar, acknowledged, royal, old, enough to claim his father's legacy, was the specific alternative claimant that the Octavian political project could not accommodate. There is an ancient anecdote, possibly apocryphal, in which Octavian's advisor Aureus quoted the Homeric line, "Not good is a multitude of Caesars. One Caesar was sufficient. One Caesar was more than enough." Caesarion was executed. He was 17. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended with him. The 300-year-old Macedonian Greek kingdom that had ruled Egypt since Alexander's general Ptolemy I took the territory in 323 BCE died with the teenage boy who was its last heir. Cleopatra's children by Antony survived. This was a political decision on Octavian's part. Killing the children of a Roman general would have raised questions in Rome that the killing of the Egyptian queen's son by a foreign general did not. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, the twin boy and girl, and the youngest son, were taken to Rome, where they appeared in Octavian's triumph. A statue of their mother, apparently a golden statue in her death regalia with the asp on her arm, was carried in the procession as the substitute for the living Cleopatra, who had denied the triumph by dying. The fate of the two boys, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, is not recorded after the triumph. The ancient sources simply stop mentioning them, which, in the ancient biographical tradition, typically means they died young, in circumstances that were not considered worth recording. Cleopatra Selene survived. She was given in marriage to Juba II of Mauritania, a Roman client king of North Africa, and appears to have been an intelligent, culturally sophisticated woman who named her son Ptolemy, and who maintained her Ptolemaic identity in the North African court that was now her home. Cleopatra Selene's son Ptolemy of Mauritania was killed in 40 CE by the Emperor Caligula, apparently because Caligula was jealous of Ptolemy's magnificent purple cloak at a gladiatorial show. The descendant of Cleopatra died over a question of clothing, which is the kind of thing that happens when the vast dynastic ambitions of one generation are compressed by history into the petty personal politics of later generations. Egypt became a Roman province, not an ordinary province. The special status of Egypt in the Roman imperial system was one of the more revealing indicators of how valuable and how strategically significant the territory was. Octavian, Augustus, as he would become, made Egypt his personal property, governed not by a senatorial proconsul as the other provinces were, but by an equestrian prefect directly accountable to the emperor. No senator was permitted to visit Egypt without imperial permission. The extraordinary wealth of Egypt flowed directly into the imperial treasury, funding the building programs and the grain distributions and the military budgets that the Augustan settlement required. The Great Library of Alexandria, whose fate is one of the most debated questions in the history of ancient scholarship, continued to function under Roman rule, though with what resources and at what level of completeness is genuinely uncertain. The Mausion continued. Alexandria continued to be a major city, a major intellectual center, a major commercial hub. The Ptolemaic dynasty was gone, but Egypt's fundamental character, the agricultural wealth, the commercial position, the cultural complexity, continued under Roman administration. The Temple of Dendera, one of the best preserved temples of ancient Egypt, whose construction was initiated during Cleopatra's reign, and whose walls contain one of the most famous depictions of Cleopatra herself, in the form of a relief carving, showing her and Caesarion making offerings to the Egyptian gods, stands today in Upper Egypt, in the state that the dry Egyptian climate has preserved it. The carving shows Cleopatra as a female pharaoh, in the specific iconographic idiom of the Egyptian divine monarchy, performing the religious functions that the Egyptian tradition assigned to the ruler as the intermediary between the human and the divine. It is one of the very few surviving contemporary representations of Cleopatra that was made during her lifetime and on her authority, and it shows her not as the Roman propaganda's oriental seductress, not as the Greek historian's cunning operator, not as the Shakespearean romantic heroine, but as a pharaoh, performing her religious duties, in the idiom of the tradition she had identified with more completely than any of her predecessors. Chapter 9. The Mythology. 2,000 years of getting Cleopatra wrong and why it matters. The first version of the Cleopatra story was Octavian's version. This is the foundational fact of the subsequent mythology, and it explains a great deal about the specific shape that the mythology took. Octavian controlled what Rome knew about Cleopatra. He had won the war. He controlled the information that Rome received about the conflict and its conclusion, and he had very specific interests in the specific version of the story that Rome accepted. The version that served his interests was the version of the dangerous Oriental temptress who had enslaved the Roman general Antony, who had used her sexuality to pursue the conquest of Rome, who had corrupted everything she touched with the luxurious dissolution of the East. This version accomplished several things simultaneously. It justified the war as a defense of Roman civilization rather than a power grab. It explained Antony's resistance to Octavian's authority as the corruption of a compromised man rather than a legitimate political conflict between equals. And it established Octavian as the defender of Roman values against the Eastern threat, the specific role that would serve his image throughout the subsequent decades of his rule as Augustus. The Roman poets absorbed and elaborated this version. Horace, Virgil, and Propertius wrote in the Augustan period, under Augustan patronage, in the cultural atmosphere that the Augustan settlement had created, and their representations of Cleopatra reflect the specific ideological framework that the Augustan settlement required. Horace's Ode on Actium, the poem that celebrates the victory as the salvation of Rome from the fatal monster, is great poetry and effective propaganda simultaneously, and the two dimensions are not separable. The tradition continued through the Roman imperial period. Plutarch, writing approximately a century and a half after Cleopatra's death, is one of the most important sources for her biography, and his parallel lives treatment of Antony, in which Cleopatra appears as the specific influence that was Antony's destruction, is more nuanced than the Horatian temptress version, but still organized around the framework of Eastern seduction and Roman corruption that Octavian's propaganda had established. Plutarch was not a propagandist. He was a genuine historian working with genuine sources, but the sources he had access to were themselves filtered through the Roman political and literary tradition that Octavian had shaped. The medieval period transmitted the Cleopatra myth in the specific form that the available classical sources provided, with the additions that the medieval moralistic tradition brought to the material. The Cleopatra of the medieval tradition was a figure of female ambition and sexuality, whose story confirmed the medieval moral framework's warnings about the dangers of powerful women and the seductive East. Chaucer's Cleopatra, in the Legend of Good Women, is a romantic heroine who dies for love. But the good in the title is the medieval category of women who were faithful to their men, and the framework of female virtue, defined by male attachment, shaped representation. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written approximately 1606 to 07, drawing on Plutarch's Life of Antony through the translation by Thomas North, is the single most influential representation of Cleopatra in the Western tradition, and it is simultaneously the most beautiful and the most distorting. Shakespeare understood the political dimensions of the story with the insight of a dramatist who was himself working in a politically complex environment, and his Cleopatra is a fully realized dramatic character whose intelligence and political awareness are present in the text alongside the seductive magnetism that the tradition required. But Shakespeare's Cleopatra is still fundamentally organized around the romance, the love story between Antony and Cleopatra that the playwright made the center of his drama, the political dimension, the actual political situation of Egypt, the actual political decisions Cleopatra was making, the actual geopolitical stakes of the conflict is present but subordinated to the romantic tragedy. The play's most famous lines are about love, about the personal relationship, about the emotional texture of the two protagonists' connection. The kingdom is the backdrop. The romance is the story. The 18th and 19th century European tradition produced an extraordinary volume of Cleopatra representation. Paintings, operas, poems, novels, sculptures, and the specific visual vocabulary of the tradition became progressively more elaborate and more orientalized. The Cleopatra of the 19th century paintings was the Cleopatra of the Orientalist fantasy, the exotic, sensuous, racially other woman of the Eastern imagination that the European imperial culture's fascination with and anxiety about the non-European world produced in enormous quantity. the Cleopatra of Jean-Léon Gérôme and of Laurence Alma-Tadema, was the product of a European cultural moment's specific fantasies about the East, about femininity, about the dangerous seductiveness of the non-European. And she had very little to do with the actual person who had governed Egypt in the 1st century BCE. The cinema produced the most powerful and most widely distributed versions of the Cleopatra myth. The 1963 Elizabeth Taylor film, the most expensive film ever made to that point, a production whose troubled history has become almost as famous as the film itself, created the visual vocabulary of Cleopatra that the late 20th century absorbed, and that the early 21st century is still living with. Taylor's Cleopatra is magnificent, fully realized, and comprehensively organized around the romantic triangle at the expense of everything else. The political content, the actual politics of the Ptolemaic survival strategy, the actual geopolitical calculation of the Roman alliance, is subordinated to the love story that the film's enormous production values made unforgettable. What all of these representations share, the Roman poets, the medieval moralists, Shakespeare, the Orientalist painters, the Hollywood productions, is the organization of the story around Cleopatra as a woman defined by her relationships with men. The romantic lens through which the mythology views her is not neutral. It is the specific distortion that the 2,000-year tradition of representing powerful women through the framework of their sexuality has applied to one of the most politically accomplished women in ancient history. The actual record of Cleopatra's accomplishments, managing the Ptolemaic succession, maintaining Egyptian independence for 20 years against the greatest military power in the world, building a political alliance that almost succeeded in creating a Ptolemaic Roman hybrid empire in the East, governing Egypt with genuine administrative competence through the extraordinary challenges of the period. These are the accomplishments that the Romantic mythology has systematically subordinated to the seduction narrative. Chapter 10. The Real Cleopatra. What the evidence actually shows. Let's do the accounting. Cleopatra ruled Egypt for approximately 21 years, from her joint accession with her father at approximately 18 until her death at 39. In those 21 years, she managed a kingdom that was simultaneously the wealthiest territory in the Mediterranean world and the most vulnerable to Roman imperial appetite. She maintained Egyptian independence for her entire reign, the only Hellenistic kingdom of the period to do so, while the others were absorbed one by one. She negotiated with the two most powerful Romans of her age, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and built political alliances with both that served Egypt's interests as well as her own. The languages. 9 languages, according to Plutarch. And while the specific number may be approximate or rhetorical, the linguistic range that the sources attribute to her is consistent with the political requirements of her position. A ruler of Egypt needed Egyptian. A ruler operating in the Hellenistic world needed Greek. A ruler managing the Roman relationship needed Latin. The Eastern connections, the trading relationships, the political contacts in Arabia and the Levant and Ethiopia required the languages of those regions. The multilingualism that the sources describe is the multilingualism of a professional diplomat who understood that the ability to speak directly to your interlocutor was a political advantage that the translator's mediation reduced. The religious identity. Cleopatra's presentation as the living Isis was not merely symbolic performance. It was the specific integration of the ruler's authority with the religious framework that Egyptian political culture required, pursued more completely than any of her predecessors had managed. The temple building, the religious donations, the specific ritual activities that connected the queen to the divine order of Egypt. These were the activities of a ruler who understood that legitimacy in Egypt required the specifically Egyptian kind of legitimacy, and who pursued it through the specifically Egyptian means, the economic management. The Ptolemaic economy was a complex, highly managed state economy. The grain monopoly, the papyrus monopoly, the oil monopoly, the various other state-controlled industries that generated the revenue that funded the dynasty's ambitions. Managing this economy required the specific administrative attention of a ruler who was involved in the details, and the fragmentary evidence of Cleopatra's administrative activity. The papyri, the decrees, the administrative records, shows a ruler who was engaged with the detail. The survival strategy. The fundamental political challenge of Cleopatra's reign was the survival of Egyptian independence in the face of Roman imperial expansion, and the strategy she pursued: the alignment with the dominant Roman faction, the building of the personal relationship into the political alliance, the use of Egypt's wealth as the leverage that the military strength she couldn't match, was the rational, intelligent strategy available to the ruler of a client kingdom facing an imperial power. It ultimately failed, but it failed when the Roman political situation produced an outcome: Octavian's victory that was not the most likely outcome at the time the strategy was formed. The alternative was to do nothing, to wait passively for Rome to absorb Egypt, as it had absorbed every other Hellenistic kingdom, without the active engagement with the Roman political process that might have produced a different result. Cleopatra's strategy gave Egypt 20 years of independence that passive submission would not have provided. It ultimately failed, but the failure was not the failure of a foolish woman blinded by love. It was the failure of an intelligent strategy in a genuinely bad situation against a genuinely formidable opponent. The coins. Several coins survive from Cleopatra's reign, bearing her portrait, and they are one of the more instructive pieces of evidence in the mythology versus reality debate. The coins show a woman with a strong nose, a prominent chin, and the specific physiognomy that the Greek portraiture tradition rendered in the specific way of contemporary likeness rather than idealized beauty. She looks like a person, not a symbol, the specific individual face of a real woman rather than the generalized classical beauty of the paintings and the films. The coins are not the face of the mythology's Cleopatra. They are the face of a real woman, rendered by the coinage that was issued on her authority and that circulated in her kingdom as the official image of the ruler. The specific contrast between the coin portrait and the Hollywood icon is one of the most direct demonstrations of the gap between the historical person and the mythological construction, and it is not a gap that flatters the mythology. The physical appearance question, whether Cleopatra was conventionally beautiful in the way that the mythology assumes, is one that Plutarch himself addresses, and his answer is more interesting than the myth. Plutarch says that her beauty was not in itself incomparable, that the attraction was in her presence, her voice, her intelligence, her conversation, the specific quality of being with her that was compelling beyond the physical dimension. This is either the ancient world's version of she had a great personality, or, more charitably, and probably more accurately, the observation of a biographer who was working from sources that knew Cleopatra through her actual presence rather than through her painting. Chapter 11. The Archaeological Hunt. The search for Cleopatra's tomb and what it might reveal. She is somewhere under the earth. The tomb of Cleopatra. The mausoleum she built for herself. The place where the ancient sources say she was buried alongside Mark Antony. The location that Octavian honored by allowing the burial to proceed, and that Alexandria's subsequent 2,000 years of rebuilding and flooding and urban development has buried under the city or the sea or the delta sediment in ways that the archaeology has not yet fully resolved, is one of the great unfound sites of ancient history. The finding of Cleopatra's tomb would be, by any measure, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history, not simply for the romantic and cultural reasons that the mythology generates, the tomb of the most famous woman in ancient history, but for the specific practical historical reasons that what was buried with Cleopatra might include materials that have not survived in any other form. The ancient sources indicate that the mausoleum Cleopatra built was large, elaborate, and contained significant treasures alongside the provisions for the afterlife, that the Egyptian and Greek traditions of royal burial required: papyrus documents, personal records, correspondence, the specific materials that might illuminate her life and her political practice in ways that the surviving ancient sources do not, could theoretically have been included in the tomb's contents, in the way that the papyri of other Egyptian burials have preserved material unavailable from any other source. The search for Cleopatra's tomb has a long history, and the most recent and most publicly prominent chapter of that history involves the work of the Egyptian Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez, who has been excavating at the site of Taposiris Magna, a temple complex approximately 45 kilometers west of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, since 2005. Taposiris Magna was a major religious center in Cleopatra's time, dedicated to Osiris and Isis, the divine couple whose mythological relationship was the template for the political and personal relationship between Cleopatra and Antony. The site has yielded significant finds: coins bearing Cleopatra's image, statues, inscriptions, and most intriguingly, a tunnel system that the excavation has been tracing through the rock beneath the temple precinct. The tunnel discovery in 2022, a rock-cut tunnel approximately 2 meters high and 1,300 meters long, running from below the temple toward the sea, generated significant media attention and the specific combination of genuine archaeological excitement and journalistic overinterpretation that major discoveries typically produce. The tunnel was described in some reports as potentially leading to Cleopatra's tomb, though the careful language of the archaeologists themselves was considerably more cautious. The tunnel is significant. It is being investigated. Its destination and purpose are being determined through the systematic excavation that proper archaeological work requires. The challenge of finding Cleopatra's tomb is not simply the challenge of locating a specific site in a large area. It is the challenge of finding a site in one of the most continuously inhabited and extensively built over urban landscapes in the world. Alexandria has been a major city for 2,300 years, and the modern city sits on top of the ancient city in ways that make the systematic archaeological investigation of the ancient remains extremely difficult. The buildings, the infrastructure, the populated streets of modern Alexandria are all above the deposits where the ancient city's most significant remains lie. The harbor of Alexandria is the other major area of investigation. The ancient royal quarter, the specific part of Alexandria where the Ptolemaic palaces and the mausoleum Cleopatra built were located, is now largely underwater. The result of the earthquakes and the land subsidence that have lowered the harbor's floor relative to the ancient ground level over the intervening 2 millennia. The underwater archaeology of Alexandria's harbor, pursued most prominently by the French archaeologist Franck Godiot since the 1990s, has produced significant finds: statues, columns, sections of ancient quays, the remains of buildings that confirm the location of the ancient royal quarter beneath the harbor waters. The specific location of the mausoleum within the ancient royal quarter is one of the questions that the underwater archaeology has not yet resolved, though the broader identification of the royal quarter's extent provides the geographic framework within which the search continues. The ancient sources describe the mausoleum as a high building, visible from the harbor apparently, and large enough to serve as the fortress-like structure that Cleopatra used in her final days, which narrows the search parameters somewhat, though the 2,000 years of harboring and rebuilding and earthquake damage that have transformed the harbor floor make the translation of ancient topographic descriptions into modern geographic coordinates a genuinely complex exercise. The DNA question has been part of the tomb hunting conversation, with the theoretical possibility that genetic material from Cleopatra's remains, if the tomb were found and the remains adequately preserved, might resolve some of the genuinely uncertain questions about her ancestry and her ethnic composition. The ancient DNA work that has been transforming our understanding of ancient population genetics is a methodology that could in principle be applied to Cleopatra's remains. If they were found, if they were preserved in a condition that yielded recoverable DNA, and if the analysis was conducted with the rigor that the significance of the material required, the skeleton of a woman found at Ephesus, known as the Arsinoe, the fourth skeleton, Arsinoe being Cleopatra's younger sister who was killed on Mark Antony's orders in 41 BCE, has been used to make claims about Cleopatra's ethnic ancestry based on skull measurements. The analysis suggested an African element in the ancestry of the individual identified as Arsinoe, which some researchers interpreted as evidence that the Ptolemaic dynasty had African genetic heritage, and by extension that Cleopatra herself may have had African ancestry. The identification of the Ephesus skeleton as Arsinoe IV is itself contested. The evidence for the identification is indirect, and the arguments against it are substantive. And the skull measurement methodology used to infer ancestry is one of the most methodologically problematic approaches in modern physical anthropology, with a history of producing inaccurate results that the field has largely moved away from in favor of the ancient DNA analysis that provides more reliable genetic information. The ethnic ancestry question is genuinely uncertain, and the specific uncertainty is worth being honest about. We do not know with certainty who all of Cleopatra's great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were. The Ptolemaic practice of brother-sister marriage and the specific marriages documented in the historical record are not always accompanied by detailed information about the non-Ptolemaic parent, and in some cases, the identity of specific ancestors is simply not recorded. What we know is that the Ptolemaic dynasty was predominantly Macedonian Greek in its ancestry for the first several generations, and that the subsequent generations were the product of the inbreeding that the dynasty's marriage practices produced. The possibility that one or more Ptolemaic rulers had a mother or grandmother of Egyptian or African ancestry is not excluded by the documentary evidence, and the specific question of Cleopatra's maternal ancestry, several generations back, is not definitively answered by the available sources. Chapter 12. The racial question, the modern debate about Cleopatra's identity and why it reveals more about us than about her. Cleopatra's ethnicity became a 21st century controversy. The 2023 Netflix documentary series that cast a black actress as Cleopatra generated an extraordinary volume of public debate. The specific, intense, sometimes ugly debate that questions of representation, historical accuracy, and racial identity produce in the current cultural moment. The Egyptian government's official cultural body formally objected to the casting. Historians produced op-eds. Social media produced everything social media produces when a controversy involving race and history and representation collides with the streaming platform's content decisions. The specific intensity of the controversy is itself historically interesting because the question it was ostensibly about, what was Cleopatra's ethnic identity, is a genuinely uncertain historical question whose genuine uncertainty the public debate consistently obscured in favor of the specific certainties that the various parties to the debate wanted to assert. Let's be clear about what the evidence shows and what it doesn't show. Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was founded by a Macedonian Greek general and which maintained its Macedonian Greek identity through the marriage practices we have described. The documentary record of the dynasty's ancestry for the first several generations is reasonably well established, and it is predominantly Macedonian Greek. The subsequent generations are less well documented in their maternal ancestry, and the specific ancestry of Cleopatra's mother, whose identity is not definitively established in the ancient sources, is one of the genuinely uncertain elements of the picture. The claim that Cleopatra was ethnically Egyptian, in the sense of being of indigenous Egyptian genetic ancestry, is not well supported by the available evidence, though it is not definitively excluded. The Ptolemaic dynasty's consistent maintenance of its Macedonian Greek identity through endogamous marriage practices makes the accumulation of substantial indigenous Egyptian ancestry in the direct Ptolemaic line unlikely, though not impossible. The claim that Cleopatra was of sub-Saharan African ancestry is similarly uncertain. The evidence for it is indirect and contested. The methodology of some of the arguments for it is problematic, and the specific historical record of the Ptolemaic dynasty's ancestry does not confirm it. It is not impossible, but it is not established. The claim that Cleopatra was phenotypically white European in the modern American sense of that term is equally unsupported by the available evidence, because the Macedonian Greeks of the ancient world were not white in the modern American racial category in any meaningful historical sense, and the application of modern American racial categories to ancient Mediterranean populations is a category error that produces more confusion than clarity. The honest answer to the question of Cleopatra's ethnic identity is she was a Macedonian Greek queen of Egypt, whose ancestry was primarily Macedonian Greek for the well-documented generations and uncertain in some of the less documented ancestral lines, who identified herself publicly as Egyptian through the religious and cultural identification with Egypt that she pursued more completely than any of her predecessors. The controversy's real content is the content of every controversy about the representation of historical figures in popular culture. Whose imagination is the historical figure available to? Whose fantasy does the historical figure get to populate? The specific intensity of the Cleopatra controversy reflects the specific intensity of the contest over this question in the current cultural moment, in which the long history of historical representation being organized primarily around white European or white American imaginative frameworks is being contested in ways that produce genuine argument about genuine questions of cultural power and representation. Cleopatra has been represented as every kind of beautiful woman that the various cultures of the past 2,000 years have found beautiful, which is to say primarily the beautiful woman of the dominant culture's beauty standards at any given moment. The Roman poets, Cleopatra was the Roman fantasy of the dangerous Eastern woman. The Renaissance paintings, Cleopatra was the European ideal of sensuous beauty. The Hollywood Cleopatra was Elizabeth Taylor, who was the 1960s Hollywood ideal of movie star beauty. The specific ethnicity attributed to Cleopatra in these representations has been the ethnicity that the representing culture found most appropriate to the specific role Cleopatra was being cast in. Most often the mysterious, exotic other, and most often rendered in the specific visual vocabulary of whatever that culture's version of exotic otherness looked like. The genuine historical Cleopatra was a Macedonian Greek woman who ruled Egypt, who identified herself as Egyptian, who was genuinely extraordinary in her political and intellectual accomplishments, and whose ethnic identity in the modern American racial sense was not a category that her world possessed or that she would have recognized as meaningful. The question of what she looked like is answered most directly by the coins, which show a specific individual face, and by Plutarch's observation that her physical appearance was not the most remarkable thing about her. What is remarkable about her is what she did, and the controversy about how to represent her has consistently, predictably, tiringly displaced the conversation about what she actually did with the conversation about what she looked like, which is a displacement that Octavian's propaganda would have recognized and approved. Chapter 13. The Legacy. What Cleopatra actually achieved and why it matters. Here is what she actually did. She ruled one of the wealthiest and most complex states in the ancient world for 21 years, from the age of 18 to the age of 39. She maintained her kingdom's independence against the greatest military power in the world through a combination of strategic alliances, diplomatic intelligence, administrative competence, and the specific political skill of making herself indispensable to the Roman figures whose support she needed. She was the last ruler of the 300-year Ptolemaic dynasty, and she held the position for longer than most of her predecessors. She was, by every indication of the historical record, one of the most educated and intellectually accomplished rulers of the ancient world. The languages, the 9 languages that Plutarch attributes to her, were the specific practical expression of the intellectual range that her education had produced. the ancient sources attribute to her written works on subjects including medicine, cosmetics, and gynecology. The texts themselves have not survived, but the attribution is evidence of the specific intellectual engagement that the sources understood her to have had. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn Egyptian. In 3 centuries of ruling Egypt, her predecessors had maintained the Greek-only policy that the Ptolemaic court had institutionalized. She broke that tradition, and the political significance of the break was enormous. The Egyptian priests who received the queen in their own language, the Egyptian farmers whose petitions were heard in their own language, the Egyptian population whose queen had made the effort to communicate directly with them rather than through the mediating distance of the translator. This was not a small thing. It was the specific acknowledgement of the relationship between ruler and ruled that the previous 3 centuries had declined to make. She presented herself as Isis, not simply wore the costume of Isis, not simply made the gesture of identification. She pursued the Isis identification as a comprehensive political and religious project, building temples, making religious endowments, performing the rituals, presenting herself in the visual language of the divine queen that the Egyptian religious tradition had developed over thousands of years. This was the political intelligence of someone who understood that legitimacy in Egypt required the specifically Egyptian kind of legitimacy, and who pursued it with more thoroughness than any of her predecessors. She negotiated with Julius Caesar and with Mark Antony, not as a suppliant or a client, but as a peer, as an allied monarch whose resources and strategic position were real leverage in the relationship, and who used that leverage with the specific combination of intelligence and pragmatism that the historical record rewards. The Caesar relationship preserved her throne and produced the heir whose existence gave her the additional legitimacy of the mother of Caesar's son. The Antony relationship was the attempt to construct a genuinely new political order in the Eastern Mediterranean, a Ptolemaic Roman hybrid empire that would have been, if it had succeeded, one of the most significant political constructions of the ancient world. It didn't succeed. Octavian won. The specific combination of Octavian's political and military skill, Agrippa's naval genius, the accumulated Roman military resources, and the specific failures of strategy and weather and luck at Actium produced the outcome that destroyed the project. The project was not foolish. It was the rational strategy for the specific situation Cleopatra was in, and it almost worked. The 20 years between Caesar's arrival and Cleopatra's death were 20 years of Egyptian independence that the passive alternative would not have produced. The argument that Cleopatra's active engagement with the Roman political process prolonged Egypt's independence by 2 decades is the argument that her strategy, even in failure, achieved something that the non-engagement strategy would not have achieved. There is no counterfactual certainty here. History doesn't provide the comparison case. But the reasonable inference is that a ruler who didn't engage actively with the Roman political process would have seen Egypt absorbed earlier rather than later. What the mythology has made of this life is the love story, the romantic tragedy of the queen who loved 2 great men and died for the greater of them. It is a beautiful story. It is a compelling story. It is a story that has generated 2,000 years of extraordinary art and literature and performance, and it is, as a complete account of the woman it purports to describe, inadequate in the specific way that reducing any complex life to its romantic dimension is inadequate. Cleopatra was a mother. 3 children by Antony, 1 by Caesar, and the management of the political identities and the survival prospects of those children was a continuous and ultimately tragic preoccupation of her last years. She was a sister. The deaths of her siblings, some in circumstances that implicate her directly, are part of the record of the dynastic violence that the Ptolemaic tradition had made routine. She was an administrator, a diplomat, a builder, a patron of the arts and sciences that the Alexandrian tradition had made the cultural expression of the Ptolemaic court. She was also, at the end, a woman in an impossible situation who refused the specific humiliation that the victor had planned for her. Whatever the method of her death, the asp, the poison, the specific mechanism that the sources debate. The decision to die on her own terms, rather than walk in Octavian's triumph, was the last political act of a career organized around the insistence on her own authority and her own identity. She had spent 21 years maintaining the position that Egypt was a sovereign kingdom, and she was its sovereign queen. She died rather than perform the public acknowledgement that she was neither. This is the actual Cleopatra, not the seductress, not the victim, not the romantic heroine who died for love, the politician who played the worst possible hand as well as anyone could have played it, who kept Egypt independent for 20 years by the force of her intelligence and her will, and who in the end chose death over the specific degradation that the victor had planned for her. No problem. I'll write 2 new expansion chapters that add the most value to the script. I'll cover Chapter 14, the Alexandria. She ruled, the extraordinary city that was her capital and what it actually looked like. Chapter 15, the women who came before. The Ptolemaic queens who shaped the tradition Cleopatra inherited, and why understanding them changes how we see her. Chapter 14, the Alexandria. She ruled, the extraordinary city that was her capital. Alexandria was not like other cities. This is not the kind of statement that requires hedging or qualification. Alexandria in the 1st century BCE was genuinely, measurably, documentably different from every other city in the Mediterranean world, in ways that the ancient sources describe with the specific combination of admiration and disbelief that the genuinely unprecedented tends to produce in observers who encounter it for the first time. It was enormous. The population estimates range from 500,000 to perhaps 1 million people. The upper end of that range would make it the most populous city in the world at the time, exceeding Rome itself in the period before Rome's explosive growth in the late Republic and early Empire. The ancient sources that describe Alexandria consistently use the vocabulary of superlatives: the largest, the wealthiest, the most cosmopolitan, the most intellectually vital. And while the superlative is a natural feature of ancient geographical description, the specific content of what they were describing justifies the language. The city plan was the plan of Alexander the Great's architect Dinocrates, laid out in the grid pattern that the Hellenistic city planning tradition favored, with the 2 main streets, the canopic way running east-west and the street crossing it north-south, each wide enough for multiple lanes of traffic, and lined with the colonnaded facades that the Hellenistic architectural tradition produced in the specific idiom of covered walkways and public display. The canopic way, in particular, was one of the most impressive urban streets in the ancient world, perhaps 30 meters wide, several kilometers long, lined with temples and public buildings, and the private palaces of the wealthy in the continuous architectural display of a city that understood that the street was a statement about the civilization that produced it. The harbor was the economic engine. Alexandria sat on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean to the north and Lake Mareotis to the south, which meant it had 2 harbors: the Great Harbor on the Mediterranean side, protected by the island of Pharos, and the artificial moles that connected it to the mainland, and the Lake Harbor on the southern side that connected to the Nile through canals and gave Alexandria direct access to the agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley. The combination of the Mediterranean harbor for the international trade and the Lake Harbor for the internal Egyptian trade made Alexandria the specific node where the commerce of the entire ancient world converged. The Pharos Lighthouse, the lighthouse on the island of Pharos that was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was the specific architectural statement of Alexandria's maritime identity. Built in the early 3rd century BCE under Ptolemy II, it was a tower of perhaps 100 to 140 meters in height. The exact dimensions are uncertain, as the structure no longer survives, whose fire was visible to ships at sea from a distance of perhaps 50 kilometers. It was not merely a navigational aid, it was a declaration. This harbor, this city, this kingdom was a presence in the world that the maritime world could not ignore, a light visible across the sea to every ship that sailed the eastern Mediterranean. The royal quarter occupied the northeastern portion of the city, jutting into the sea on the headland that the ancient sources call the Cape Lochius. The Ptolemaic palaces, the multiple buildings that the dynasty had constructed and expanded over 3 centuries of occupation, were not a single palace in the modern sense, but a complex of interconnected structures, gardens, harbors, and facilities that the ancient sources describe as occupying a quarter to a third of the total city area. This was the space in which Cleopatra lived and worked, the administrative center from which she governed Egypt, the ceremonial space in which the rituals of divine monarchy were performed, the private space in which the more intimate dimensions of her life occurred. The library was the intellectual crown of the royal quarter. The Great Library of Alexandria, founded by Ptolemy I and expanded by his successors, was the specific institution that made Alexandria's intellectual reputation, the place where the ambition of the Ptolemaic dynasty to collect and organize all the knowledge of the ancient world was expressed in the specific physical form of hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls. The specific collection size that the ancient sources report, estimates range from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, is almost certainly exaggerated in the tradition of ancient statistical enthusiasm, but the library was genuinely the largest collection of ancient knowledge in the world, and its existence in Alexandria meant that the city was the specific location where the scholarship of the ancient world concentrated. The Mausion, the research institution connected to the library, whose name is the origin of the modern word museum, was the space where the scholars worked. Not scholars in the general sense of educated people who read and thought, but the specific professional researchers who were supported by the Ptolemaic patronage system to produce the scholarly work that the dynasty valued as a demonstration of cultural ambition. Euclid worked in Alexandria. Archimedes studied there. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with extraordinary accuracy using the angle of the sun's shadow at different latitudes, was the chief librarian. The Hellenistic revolution in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literary scholarship that produced some of the most significant intellectual achievements of the ancient world happened in Alexandria, in the institutions that the Ptolemaic patronage had built and sustained. Cleopatra had grown up in this environment, and the intellectual seriousness that the ancient sources attribute to her was not simply the product of individual talent, but of the specific cultural context of the Alexandrian court. The court that produced the scholarly tradition of the library was a court in which intellectual engagement was a value, in which the ruler's participation in the intellectual life of the institution was part of the role's expectations, in which the specific combination of political power and intellectual patronage that the Ptolemaic tradition had cultivated from its beginning was the model of rulership that Cleopatra had absorbed from childhood. The city's population was the other extraordinary feature, not just its size, but its specific composition. Alexandria was the most diverse city in the ancient world, in the specific sense of containing large, established communities of multiple ethnic and religious identities that maintained their own institutions and their own internal governance, while participating in the larger economic and social life of the city. The Greek population, the descendants of the original Macedonian and Greek settlers, the ongoing immigration of Greeks from across the Hellenistic world, was the dominant culture of the city's public life. The Egyptian population, the native Egyptians who had lived on the land before Alexander arrived, and who constituted the majority of the broader Egyptian population, was present in the city in significant numbers, though their role in the Greek-dominated civic life was more constrained than their numbers would suggest. The Jewish population of Alexandria was one of the most significant Jewish communities in the ancient world, larger in the 1st century BCE than the Jewish population of Jerusalem itself, by some estimates. The Alexandrian Jewish community had produced the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, scriptures that was the form in which the Jewish religious texts became accessible to the Greek-speaking world. and the intellectual interaction between the Jewish and Greek scholarly traditions in Alexandria was one of the most productive intellectual exchanges of the ancient world. Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher who produced the specific synthesis of Jewish theology and Greek philosophy that would prove enormously influential on the subsequent development of both Christian and Jewish thought, worked in Alexandria in the generation after Cleopatra's death. The specific language of the city's public life was Greek, the administrative language, the language of the law courts and the commercial contracts and the scholarly institutions. But the languages spoken in the streets and the markets were the languages of the city's diverse population: Egyptian, Aramaic, Hebrew, the various languages of the Eastern Mediterranean traders who came to Alexandria's harbor with goods from every corner of the ancient world. Cleopatra's 9 languages were not the affectation of the linguistically gifted. They were the practical equipment of a ruler who governed a city in which 9 languages were not an unusual range. The city's specific physical beauty, the white marble of the public buildings, the colonnaded streets, the harbor with the pharaoh's lighthouse, the gardens of the royal quarter extending to the sea, was the beauty of an urban environment that had been deliberately designed to be the most impressive city in the world, and that had succeeded by the standards of its time. The ancient sources that describe Alexandria, travelers, geographers, the scholars who came to study at the library, describe it with the vocabulary of the extraordinary, the city that exceeded expectation, that surpassed the traveler's preparation for it, that maintained its reputation for magnificence as a lived reality rather than merely a tradition. This was the city Cleopatra ruled. The library, and the Mausion, and the harbor, and the pharaohs, and the royal quarter, and the cosmopolitan, multilingual, intellectually vital urban environment that was simultaneously the most important commercial hub and the most important intellectual center in the Mediterranean world. The woman who governed this city was governing something genuinely extraordinary, and the governance required the specific combination of administrative intelligence, cultural sophistication, and political skill that the extraordinary city demanded. The loss of Alexandria as it was, the library, the Mausion, the specific intellectual environment that the Ptolemaic patronage had built over 3 centuries, is one of the genuine losses of ancient history, not the dramatic single burning that the mythology has tended to emphasize, but the gradual degradation and displacement that the Roman period, the subsequent centuries of political upheaval, and the specific natural disasters of the earthquake, and the subsidence that have put much of the ancient city under the harbor water produced over the long arc of the city's transformation. When you look at the coins with Cleopatra's specific individual face, you are looking at the ruler of that city, the last ruler of that city, in the specific form that the Ptolemaic dynasty had made it. The city continued after her, because cities do. But the specific version of it that she governed, the version with the library and the Mausion, and the divine queen's court, and the specific synthesis of Greek and Egyptian culture that the Ptolemaic tradition had produced, ended when she died, and the world that replaced it was a different world. Chapter 15. The women who came before. The Ptolemaic queens who shaped Cleopatra's world. Cleopatra did not invent the powerful Ptolemaic queen. She inherited the tradition, and understanding what she inherited changes the way you understand what she did with it. The Ptolemaic dynasty had, from very early in its history, produced women of extraordinary political power and political intelligence, and the specific model of queenship that Cleopatra practiced was not her innovation, but her refinement of a tradition that her predecessors had established over 3 centuries. The tradition begins in its most direct form with Arsinoe II, the sister and wife of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled in the early 3rd century BCE and who established the template of the powerful Ptolemaic co-ruling queen that would define the dynasty's political culture for the subsequent 300 years. Arsinoe II was the specific innovator. She had been previously married to Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, and to Ptolemy Ceraunus, her half-brother, whose subsequent murder of her children from the Lysimachus marriage was the specific personal catastrophe that preceded her arrival in Egypt and her marriage to her full brother Ptolemy. 2. The brother-sister marriage was not the standard practice of the Hellenistic kingdoms. It was the specific Ptolemaic innovation, drawing on the Egyptian divine tradition in which the divine couple, Osiris and Isis, were also brother and sister, and presenting the ruling pair as the divine couple's human manifestation. Arsinoe II was the specific architect of this presentation, and its political function was precise. The divine couple legitimated the dynastic marriage in the Egyptian religious framework, and the Egyptian religious framework provided the legitimacy that the Macedonian Greek rulers needed from their Egyptian subjects. The identification of the ruling queen with Isis, which Cleopatra would eventually pursue with greater completeness than any of her predecessors, was the tradition that Arsinoe II had initiated. Arsinoe II held the formal title of co-ruler. She was officially Ptolemy II's co-regent, her name appearing alongside his in the official documentation, her portrait on the coins, her image in the temples alongside his. She was the specific model of the politically co-equal queen that the Ptolemaic system had developed, and she was worshipped as a divine figure during her own lifetime. The cult of the deified Arsinoe Philadelphus was established while she was still alive, the specific apotheosis of a queen who had managed her political identity with the sophistication of someone who understood that the divine and the political were not separate categories in the Egyptian world she had adopted as her framework. After Arsinoe II's death, her image continued to appear on coins, her cult continued to be maintained, and her influence on the model of Ptolemaic queenship continued through the subsequent generations. The queens who followed her, the various Berenices and Arsinoes of the subsequent Ptolemaic generations, varied enormously in their individual political power and political engagement, but the template that Arsinoe II had established, the divine co-ruling queen, identified with Isis, with her own cult and her own political authority, remained the framework within which the powerful Ptolemaic queen operated. Berenice II, the wife of Ptolemy III, Euergetes, who ruled in the mid-3rd century BCE, was another example of the politically active Ptolemaic queen, and her story is instructive in the specific ways that the tradition accommodated and sometimes struggled with female power. Berenice II had been the queen of Cyrene before her marriage to Ptolemy III, ruling independently in Cyrene with the political authority of a ruler in her own right, rather than merely a consort. When she married Ptolemy III and became the Queen of Egypt as well, she brought to the Egyptian court the specific experience of a woman who had governed a kingdom and who expected to exercise genuine political authority rather than merely the ceremonial version that a more traditional understanding of the consort's role would have provided. The lock of Berenice's hair, the specific story that the poet Callimachus told, in which Berenice dedicated a lock of her hair to the gods for her husband's safe return from campaign, and the lock mysteriously disappeared from the temple, and the court astronomer Conan declared it had been placed among the stars as a new constellation, is one of the more charming episodes of the Ptolemaic cultural record, and it was the specific poem that Catullus translated into Latin and that introduced the story to the Roman literary tradition. The constellation Coma Berenices, Berenice's hair, still bears her name in the modern astronomical catalog. She is the only Ptolemaic queen to have a constellation. The two Cleopatras who preceded Cleopatra VII in the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra I, who ruled as regent for her son after the death of Ptolemy V in 180 BCE, and Cleopatra II and the Third, who were involved in the complex dynastic conflicts of the 2nd century BCE, represent the tradition of the politically active Ptolemaic queen in its more contested and more turbulent manifestations. Cleopatra II at one point ruled Egypt alone. The specific circumstances of the conflict between her husband-brother Ptolemy VIII, and her daughter Cleopatra III produced a decade-long dynastic civil war in the 130s BCE that ended with the reconciliation of the three parties in the specific improbable arrangement that the Ptolemaic tradition of accommodation could produce. Cleopatra III, Cleopatra VII's great-grandmother, was perhaps the most powerful of the Ptolemaic queens before Cleopatra VII herself. She ruled jointly with her two sons successively, first with Ptolemy IX and then with Ptolemy X. And the ancient sources describe her as the dominant partner in both co-rulerships, the son a nominal co-ruler in the formal documentation, while the actual governing authority was the queen. Her titles on the official inscriptions are remarkable. She took the male title of pharaoh alongside the female title, presenting herself in both the masculine and the feminine idiom of the divine monarchy. Simultaneously, the tradition that Cleopatra VII inherited was therefore not the tradition of the ornamental queen, the consort, whose political role was ceremonial rather than substantive. It was the tradition of the politically active, divinely identified, administratively engaged queen who might, in favorable circumstances, be the dominant partner in the co-rulership or the sole ruler in her own right. The specific predecessors who had established this tradition were the models that Cleopatra VII was working within and extending, and understanding them changes the way you read her own career. The specific difference between Cleopatra VII and her predecessors was not that she was more powerful. Cleopatra III had arguably exercised more formal political dominance within the co-rulership structure. It was that she did it in the specific historical moment when the Roman system was consuming the last of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and that the political intelligence and the diplomatic skill that she brought to the position were precisely the qualities that the moment demanded, and that, in the end, were insufficient to overcome the military and political reality of Octavian's victory. The women who came before Cleopatra VII had navigated the specific political challenges of the Ptolemaic system. The dynastic conflicts, the co-rulership politics, the management of the Egyptian religious and administrative establishment. Cleopatra VII navigated all of these and added the specific existential challenge of the Roman imperial appetite. The tradition she inherited gave her the tools, the divine legitimacy, the administrative expertise, the model of the powerful queen, and the specific historical moment she inhabited tested those tools against a challenge that the tradition had not anticipated. The Ptolemaic queens who came before her are the context without which Cleopatra VII is incomprehensible. She was the culmination of a 300-year tradition of extraordinary female political power, the last and, in many ways, the greatest expression of the specific model of queenship that the Ptolemaic dynasty had developed. The tradition ended with her, as the dynasty ended with her, as the world that had produced the tradition was absorbed into the Roman imperial system that replaced it. But the tradition was real, and it was extraordinary, and it produced women whose political accomplishments were as significant as anything the ancient world's male rulers achieved, and who have been systematically forgotten in the 2,000 years since their world ended in favor of the romantic mythology that found the seductress more interesting than the ruler. The queens of Egypt were extraordinary, all of them, and the last of them was the most extraordinary of all. Conclusion: she was 39 years old. Think about that for a moment. The person whose life this script has been tracing. The person who managed the Roman alliance, who governed Egypt through the chaos of the late Roman Republic's civil wars, who built the Eastern Empire project with Antony, who negotiated the endgame with Octavian, who made the final decision in the mausoleum, was 39 years old when it ended. She had been a functioning political ruler since the age of 14, had been the senior co-ruler with her father from approximately 18, had been sole ruler since 21. 21 years of ruling one of the most demanding and most vulnerable positions in the ancient world. 21 years of managing the Roman relationship, the internal Egyptian politics, the administration of the most complex state economy in the Mediterranean, the religious ceremonies, the building programs, the military campaigns, the negotiations, the alliances. The mythology has turned her into an icon of seductive beauty and romantic tragedy. The actual person who lived those 21 years was something considerably more interesting. A politician of extraordinary intelligence, operating in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty, with more success than the mythology's romantic tragedy frame allows, and with a final failure that was the failure of external circumstance and military defeat, rather than the failure of personal weakness or romantic delusion. She would not have recognized herself in the paintings. The elongated eyes, the elaborate headdress, the asp on the arm, the specific visual vocabulary that the 2,000 years of representation has created around her name was not her representation of herself. Her representation of herself was the pharaonic image on the temple walls, the queen performing the religious rituals of the divine monarchy in the specifically Egyptian idiom. Her representation of herself was the coins, the specific individual face of the woman who was also a ruler, presented in the direct portrait tradition of the Hellenistic coinage. The gap between who she was and what she became. The gap between the 39-year-old Macedonian Greek queen who ruled Egypt and died in a mausoleum rather than walk in a Roman triumph, and the timeless seductress of the paintings and the films, is one of the most instructive gaps in Western cultural history. It shows us how completely a person can be transformed by the specific needs and anxieties of the cultures that inherit their story. It shows us how effectively propaganda, when it wins, shapes the record for centuries. And it shows us how the specific details that survive, the coins, the temple carvings, the fragmentary papyri, the critical readings of the ancient sources, can, if we look at them carefully enough, give us something closer to the actual person. The actual person was extraordinary, not in the mythology's terms, not the irresistible beauty, not the romantic heroine, in the actual terms of what she did with what she had, in the situation she was in the time she had to do it. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was the last of the Ptolemies. She was the woman who held the line for 21 years against the greatest military power in the world, and who, when the line finally broke, refused to give the victor the victory parade he had been building toward. The asp, real or symbolic, was the last political statement of a career full of political statements, and it was, as Charmian said, extremely well done, befitting the descendant of so many kings.